A few years ago, we were driving around as a family, enjoying our Friday fun day, and out of nowhere, I hear this phrase from the back seat. They have the meats. Well, that's not something you hear every day. So I peeked in the rearview mirror, and Joy, who was 3 at the time, was pointing out the window at something alongside the road. And once I sort of tracked in the direction she was pointing, it all started to make sense. She was pointing at a sign for an Arby's restaurant. And the tagline in every Arby's commercial is this: we have the meats. So Joy saw the sign and instinctively knew that is the place where you go to find the meats. And we still laugh about that today. Have you ever stopped to think about how many advertisements the average person sees in a day? Let's do this. I want you to take 60 seconds right now as a home church and just make a guess on what you think that average is. I'm curious what kinds of numbers you tossed out, but I'm willing to bet they were probably not high enough. Because the reality is, we don't really know for sure, but the estimate for the average person is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 ads every single day, which is crazy. And that's roughly double the average from 2007, when a research firm estimated the total to be up to about 5,000 advertisements a day. And if we go way back, if we go back to the 1970s, the reported average was between 500 to 1,600 ads per day. Right? That's staggering. But I don't think any of us would say that's a surprise. And what are those thousands of ads trying to tell you and me? You aren't complete until you have fill in the blank. You're not happy unless you have this product. You're not financially secure without that service or account. You can't really be special unless you get this item. If you really want to be satisfied, if you want the meats, right, you need to go to Arby's. And it's no wonder we are dissatisfied as a culture. And I think of the old Rolling Stones song, I can't get enough satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. And that is the cry of our culture. And we strive and we scratch and we claw in our search for satisfaction. But what if we could find something that truly satisfies? Now, that's the promise in the beatitude that we're going to be looking at today. And we're continuing in our series, What If Jesus Was Serious? Looking at 8 statements from Jesus on what the hashtag blessed life looks like. And these beatitudes have the power to radically shape how we view the rest of what Jesus says, if we'll take him seriously. And today's passage is good news for those who are dissatisfied, who can't get no satisfaction. Those who are weary with the search for what can truly bring meaning and purpose. And if I could sum up the message today in a big idea, it would be this. And if you've been memorizing Mathew 5-6 leading up to this won't be a surprise. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice. God blesses those who hunger and thirst for justice. In a way, the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12 are an advertisement. They would have grabbed the attention of those who gathered on the hillside to listen to Jesus teach. You see, crowds gathered everywhere he went. because there was just something different about Jesus. Sure, they had encountered teachers or rabbis before, but none that displayed such power and spoke with such authority. And I think at the end of this section of Scripture, which is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, in Matthew 7 verses 28 through 29, it ends with this. And so it was, when Jesus finished these words, that the crowds were astonished at his teaching. He was teaching them, you see, on his own authority, not like their scribes used to do. So Jesus taught with authority, and the crowds were in awe. The Sermon on the Mount was an advertisement for God's incoming kingdom. That's what Jesus came to proclaim, right? The kingdom of God is near. And that was welcome news, especially to those who felt least likely to be welcomed into it. So let's start reading in Matthew chapter 5, verse 1, as we lead up to our beatitude today, which is verse 6. So starting in Matthew 5:1. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the hillside and sat down. His disciples came to him. He took a deep breath and began his teaching. Blessings on the poor in spirit. The kingdom of heaven is yours. Blessings on the mourners. You're going to be comforted. Blessings on the meek. You're going to inherit the earth. In verse 6, blessings on people who hunger and thirst for God's justice. You're going to be satisfied. As we listen to these statements from Jesus as a whole, verse 6 just kind of has a different feel to it, right? I mean, so far each beatitude has sort of this short, sort of succinct and memorable kind of phrasing to it. But verse 6 is longer and it's more descriptive. So let's dig into this beatitude and see what Jesus was saying to those on the hillside then, and what I believe he longs to say to you and to me today. And we're going to break this down into smaller sections, just as we have with every beatitude, and start first with a quick recap of the first two words that show up in every single one of these beatitudes. Blessings on people who. As we have made note of throughout this series every week, that the word for bless here in the Greek is the word makarios, meaning happy, blissful, fortunate, or flourishing. And it's a direct translation of the Hebrew word ashrei, and that word means fortunate. So this is different than what we typically think of when we think of blessed, right? Normally, just to sort of speak a blessing means to speak God's favor or his provision over someone or something. But that doesn't fit here, does it? I don't think any of us would look at those who hunger and thirst and say, man, they're living the hashtag blessed life. I don't think any of us go around saying, may you be hungry, right? That's not something we would wish on anybody. Verse 6 is a really good picture of how makarios should be understood, because it's pronouncing blessing on a certain way of being in the world. Blessings on people who, it's descriptive here of a type of person. So what it's saying is there is flourishing, there is contentedness for those who hunger and thirst, for those who aren't satisfied. Okay, they stand the most to gain in God's incoming kingdom. Blessings on people who hunger and thirst for God's justice. I love that Jesus took a common human feeling and connected it to God's kingdom, right? We've all felt what it means to be hungry or thirsty. Maybe that's how you're feeling right now. So I'm sorry in advance for all the food talk. It's amazing how that desire can drive you, right, when you're hungry and thirsty. And in the ancient Jewish world, people knew what true hunger and thirst were like. They didn't have grocery stores. Food and water weren't as abundant then as they are now. And especially for those on the lower rungs of society, like many who followed Jesus, hunger was a normal part of life. And it's a daily need, right? Something you can't go for long without satisfying. And in the Gospel of Luke, there's a similar but smaller list of beatitudes that we've talked a bit about, known as the Sermon on the Plain. And one of the ones referenced there is similar to what we're looking at here in Mathew 5:6, and it's in Luke chapter 6, verse 21. It shares this beatitude this way: God blesses you who are hungry now, for you will be satisfied. There's a focus on hunger being satisfied, but there's a key difference. There's a key phrase that isn't here, and that missing phrase really sets the stage for how we understand Jesus' promise of blessing here in Matthew 5:6. Everything hinges on the meaning of the words God's justice. So your Bible may say righteousness. What are we supposed to do with that, right? How can there be different words for the same verse? So the righteousness and justice are different words in the English language. In the original text, they come from the same word, dikaiosine. Try saying that 5 times fast. The idea of here is of doing right by someone, or right relationships in all areas of life. And we would tend to compartmentalize these two words, righteousness and justice. Justice is like, it's a legal term, right? It deals with wronging, or with making right things that are wrong in a legal state. Righteousness is a spiritual term. It deals with one's standing before God. But the dikaiosine involved all of life. Living according to God's law was doing right by God, righteousness, okay? But then also treating others as equally loved by God was doing right by them, justice. So to hunger for righteousness means to love God with all your being and to love your neighbor the way you love yourself. To do right by God, others, and even nature, even creation itself. And I think of Jesus' response when he was asked by a religious leader, what is the greatest commandment? This is how Jesus responded to that loaded question in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 39. And Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And a second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. So all the means of doing right by God and others can be summed up in these two commandments. Love God and love others. To hunger and thirst for righteousness is to desire God's love and then embody that love at school, at work, in relationships and parenting, and everything we say and we do. Just as a person can't live without food or water, we cannot live without God. We were made to be fueled by God's life and love. He is the only food that will nourish us, the only drink that will satisfy our thirst. And I think of Jesus as he's saying this. I'm sure the words of Psalm 63 were probably on his mind as they really capture well the feelings of hunger and thirst that are described here. So let me read out of Psalm 63, verses 1 through 5. O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. I've seen you in your sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up my hands to you in prayer. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. I will praise you with songs of joy. I love the descriptive words here of this longing for God. My soul thirsts, my whole body longs. It's like a rumbling stomach. And then I love how verse 5 kind of resolves this. It says, you satisfy me. It's the same wording as in our beatitude, with the richest feast, meaning like literally a fatty meal, like prime rib and gravy type of satisfaction. Blessings on people who hunger and thirst for God's justice. And what's the promise there? You're going to be satisfied. And this reminds me of a cruise that Risa and I went on years ago. We were cruising the Baja coast of Mexico in February, which I would not recommend. It's actually a pretty bad time to be on the water because it's stormy season. And that ship would lurch back and forth. And I don't normally get seasick, but I got seasick at one point on that trip. So much so that for 24 hours, I didn't eat. Which is a big deal because when you're on a cruise ship out at sea, that's basically all you do. So there were multiple meals where I just had to sit and watch because I wasn't hungry. But thankfully, we reached our next port of destination, which was Ensenada, Mexico. And I finally had a chance to get off this lurching boat. And you kind of were walking around still doing this thing. And as we walked the streets, my nose suddenly was filled with the most amazing smell. A bakery. I was smelling the pastries from this Mexican bakery. And suddenly I was hungry again. And I ate some of the best pastries I've ever tasted in my life. I mean, it was a moment of pure blessing from the Lord. And I wonder how many people walked by that shop, because it was right along the main route there, and didn't get to experience what I did because they weren't hungry. Because I was hungry, I was best positioned to partake in the goodies from that bakery. And sorry, I'm assuming you're probably all hungry now. But that's the idea of satisfied here. It literally means to be stuffed to the gills, if that's a phrase you've ever used. And going back to the saturation of advertisements in our daily lives, as we talked about at the beginning, the goal of any ad is to develop an appetite. You aren't going to satisfy what you don't have an appetite for. And like my trip in Mexico, my appetite was what paved the way for me to be satisfied by those amazing Mexican pastries. And that's what Jesus is challenging us with here. The advertisement for God's incoming kingdom and these beatitudes was meant to create an appetite for living in close relationship with God. And those with a desire for God, who hunger and thirst for his words and living in tune with his kingdom, he says they will be satisfied. Happy are those who are fattened or gorged or overflowing with love for God, for themselves, and for their neighbors. Happy are those who partner with God to meet the deep hurts of the world with his deep love. You see, there's plenty of room at God's banquet table. All the food and drink you want. Come, you're invited to the life you were created for. And as we wrap up this message, I just have a few next steps for us. And the first is become a follower of Jesus. And I have to ask, have you been searching for something to satisfy the deep longings you have in your heart? Have you tried to fill your soul with the latest and greatest solutions that our culture throws at you? All those things that it says you need to have this if you want to be happy. That hunger, that desire, it's a good thing. And Jesus longs to see you satisfied. He longs to fill you with his love. If that's you, if the world hasn't satisfied, if you've been left wanting, true satisfaction begins by inviting Jesus to save you, to set you free, to fill you with his love. Would you let someone in your home church know if that is where you're at today? We would love to pray for you. Would love to help you take next steps on what it means to follow Jesus. Another next step is this: develop an appetite. Remember, what we crave is what we will fill. Do you desire God? Do you hunger and thirst for him? What about others? Do you desire to live rightly towards those around you? My prayer is that we would daily desire God's righteousness, his justice, to love him with the whole of what makes me, me, and makes you, you, and to love others from that position of being loved by God. So how can you, like we read in Psalm 63:1, cultivate a heart that longs for God, that thirsts for his love like someone lost in a desert without water? Also, are there others around you in need of justice, who haven't been shown love or treated as the valuable God image bearer that they are? And may we develop an appetite for God's justice. And the last next step is memorize Mathew 5:7. And let me read that for you in preparation for next week's message. Blessings on the merciful, you'll receive mercy yourselves. Blessings on the merciful, you'll receive mercy yourselves. You take some time to marinate on that and allow it to sink deep into your hearts in preparation for next week's message. I pray as you desire God this week that He fills you to overflowing. God bless Oasis.